One day, the boss came in and he said, "Oh, those discs on the floor. Clear out this place, tidy up the room, you see." So Tim and I got down to work and we went, there was a pile of, literally, this is quite literally true, and I know my memory is not playing me false. There was a pile of these discs on the floor, getting all dusty. And Tim and I began to look at them. We saw talk by Bernard Shaw, talk by H.G. Wells, talk by Asquith, Churchill, Lloyd George, Chesterton. Tim and I looked at one another and we said, "No way can these be destroyed. Something's got to be done."
Whither Britain? Now what a question. Even if I knew, and you know very well that I don't know, could I tell you in half an hour? Put a reasonable question. Say a little bit of the big question. Is Britain heading straight for war? That's what you want to know, isn't it?
I didn't know what to do. I thought of trying to explain that I was a lecturer. But that wouldn't do, because some of them had been to my lecture.
And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front the sun climbs slow, how slowly? But westward, look, the land is bright.
The preserved voices of the great, George Bernard Shaw, Winston Churchill, and perhaps the less familiar voice in the middle of G.K. Chesterton. Marie Slocombe, with Timothy Eckersley, nephew of Peter Eckersley, the BBC's first chief engineer, working in Broadcasting House in the late 1930s, between them came to a conclusion that day-to-day radio would become a crucial witness in the future. That pile of discs was the beginning of the BBC Sound Archive, the foundation of one of the world's great historical resources. From that beginning, Marie Slocombe and her head of department, Linton Fletcher, consciously created a policy of approaching archives as oral history, and that extended beyond the great and the good to events and the stories of ordinary people. Simon Rooks is the current director of the BBC Sound Archive and an inheritor of Marie Slocombe's legacy.
I think that's very clear from right at the beginning, and we've got, fortunately, recordings of Marie Slocombe in the early years from the 40s, where they're very clear about it's not just about the great and the good.
I'm not going to play you records by eminent people. You'll remember those. But I've chosen a few of the many hundreds we are making in which ordinary people tell their stories. The first two deal with similar situations. They're about the fight against fire, and they deal with peak moments of intense personal experience. And I think, together, they say something about the spirit of our own time, something that will still be worth saying 100 years hence.
Their mission, if you like, their, to some extent, self-appointed mission was to capture the life of the nation, primarily for broadcasting purposes, but they had a very much a sense of the historical importance of what they were doing.
First, a pilot on the wing of a burning plane in mid-air.
I couldn't get right down flat because of the parachute on my chest. The wind kept lifting me off the wing. Once it slapped me right back against the fuselage, but I managed to get hold again and get back. The slipstream from the engine made things worse. It was like being in a terrific gale, but worse than anything I've known before. Can't explain it, but there was no real sense of danger out there. It was just a matter of doing one thing after another, and that's about all there was to it.
And then firefighting nearer home, among a set of gas holders, 5 of them already alight. This man rushed through the flames to turn off the gas and save the others.
It was instinct. It's my job to look after the gas holders. There wasn't time to get the asbestos suit and put it on, so I pulled my coat over my head and ran through the flames.
Marie Slocombe certainly appreciated the value of recording the experiences of ordinary people, quite often in extraordinary circumstances, but the lives of ordinary people too.
Sailors have the gift of telling a good story. One sailor tells us that the battered guns of the Bismarck drooped like dead flowers.
Well, after a bit the moon got up and lit us up like daylight. It felt as if all the searchlights in the country were on us. And we weren't long left in doubt about the enemy's ideas, because shortly after that, down came Jerry out of the moon again. We could see him this time, diving down at us, firing with his followed machine gun for all he was worth. We fired back with every gun we had, and we hit him.
As I rode out on a May morning, right early, I met my love upon the way, oh Lord, but she was early.
It's hardly surprising that Marie Slocombe's interest in sound as direct witness should encompass folk song and its social roots. Her work with the English Folk Dance and Song Society informed aspects of her thinking as a BBC archivist and vice versa. Malcolm Taylor, librarian at the Society's Vaughan Williams Memorial Library in Cecil Sharp House, knew Marie and retains a clear memory of her personality and demeanour.
My most fond memory of her, actually, was the last time I ever saw her. It was her 80th birthday, and two of the trustees of the English Folk Dance and Song Society had tracked her down, and they'd heard she was leaving London and wanted to bring her in and have a tea party on her birthday, and she did. It was in this room. It was absolutely lovely, and I remember she came in a print dress with that sort of gentility that you read in Agatha Christie novels. You know, she's a bit like Miss Marple in a way, you know, the Joan Hickson type character. And when we sat down to have tea, I remember looking at Marie and thinking, this is a person you must never give a mug of tea to. It was strictly bone china if possible, but very much a cup and saucer person. And not only that, you know, you could only pour the milk from a milk jug, never from a bottle or a carton. She was of that gentility that often actually gets criticised for being conservative, almost with a big C, you know. But really, I found with her, she was very liberal-minded, very conscious of that British fairness and awareness of community around her, which I suppose is why she was interested in traditional music, because it came from community, it came from ordinary people, and that was a great strength.
I came to London at a time when there was quite serious unemployment. This is the early 30s. Not many people remember that there was a period of quite serious unemployment. And I knew that a good degree would get me nowhere. So I came to London and I took a secretarial course. And from there I went and worked as a secretary in the Foreign Office for several years. I was personal secretary to Sir Robert Craigie, who was one of the Under-Secretaries of State, and it was a sort of personal secretary job. Very interesting, very ill-paid, but very interesting. And I stuck to that until he was appointed ambassador in Tokyo. So I decided this was the moment to look around. And I answered an advertisement in the paper for secretaries in television, which had just begun. And I thought, now this is interesting, it's the coming thing. Maybe, there would be possibilities. I got an interview, and it was in the time of Lord Reith. He was Sir John Reith. He knew my boss at the Foreign Office. I don't know whether that had anything to do with it. I did have an interview with him, which was quite fun. And eventually they said, well, look, come into radio.
Recording for broadcast was revolutionised in the early 1930s by Cecil Watt's invention of the cellulose acetate disc, which created an almost instantaneous playback of recorded material. But the discs weren't built to last. Watts had been a band leader who devised the technology as a rehearsal device. So in order to retain the content, it had to be transferred to more durable media. This was possible, but at a cost, and in 1937-38, the issue that would remain a bane of the BBC conscience, the appropriate spending of licence payers' money, had already reared its head.
Spending listeners' money. So, we have to have authority to spend outside. Well, we talked about it, and Linton lobbied people, And we eventually got agreement to begin a small scheme of preserving a selection of some of these records. A selection from a Bernard Shaw talk, 4.5 minutes, one side of a disc, and so on. And I can remember in those days, this is 1937-38, I can remember typing each week a short memo listing 4 or 5 items which we had selected for what we call processing, preserving in this way, and saying why we thought it was worth spending money on. It would be about £5 or £6 a side. And I can remember one week, usually we said H.G. Wells, whose voice is not yet represented in the archives. We didn't call them archives, in the library. I remember quite distinctly saying by George Bernard Shaw, and although we have already a representation of this voice in the library, we think the eminence of the speaker warrants a second sample. You see, it was very tentative, because from the administrative point of view, we were operating entirely on license fees, listeners' money. How was this benefiting the listener? And when you've only got 20 such records on the shelf, there isn't a great deal you can do with them, is there, after all? You can't make many programs. You're not going to quote from them very often. If you've got 2,000, it begins to look a little more promising. When you've got 20,000, somebody begins to say, ha-ha, you see. And so we kept on saying, but this is for the listener of the future.
You've been listening to a recording, the third talk by the director of the BBC Recorded Programmes Department, Linton Fletcher.
It was about preserving recordings, life of the nation, events, people, very much with an idea that people 100 years hence would want to listen to and understand the lives. And he makes several references to that in recordings that we have of him now.
When the Brains Trust was asked at which scene in history its members would have liked most to be present, some of you may have heard Dr. Joad reply,
"Well, I would have liked to have been present at the death of Socrates, which I think to be the noblest death in history, with one exception, which I shan't name, and to have taken part with Socrates' friends in the discussion on the immortality of the soul which preceded that death."
Well, we haven't got a record of Socrates, because, so far as we know, there was no electrical recording in the year 400 BC. But if there had been, the Brains Trust might have been able to go along to our Recorded Programmes library and have asked for Socrates, please, last conversations and trial. And then the librarian would have consulted the card index,
Socrates' friends, sociology, soda fountain, Zelda's chorus, I hated Socrates.
and then she would have gone to the shelves of the library, taken out perhaps half a dozen records, escorted the members of the Brains Trust through to the listening cubicle, and there, whatever their views about the immortality of the soul, they would have ceased to have had any about the immortality of the voice of Socrates.
We are trying to represent in sound as much of contemporary life and the personalities around us and the things that happen that we get, mainly, of course, through BBC programmes.
Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that it is people of public distinction.
Oh, no. We believe that ordinary people who have stories to tell and experiences to relate are part of the history of our time, which is worth preserving in sound.
Several of us scrambled up onto the slippery bottom of the raft, and it was from there I saw the Titanic sink. As I watched, I could see her bow getting deeper and deeper in the water, with the foremast sticking up above the surface, whilst her stern lifted higher and higher, till it was right out of the water. When she got to an angle of about 60 degrees, there was a sullen sort of rumbling roar, as her massive boilers all left their beds and went crashing down through the bulk's heads and everything that stood in their way. Up to that moment,
She had stood out as clear with her rows of electric lights all burning. When the boilers broke away, she was, of course, plunged into absolute darkness, though her huge black outline was still perfectly distinct up against the stars and sky. Slowly she reared up on end, till at last she was absolutely perpendicular. Then, quite quietly, but quicker and quicker, she seemed just to slide away under the surface and disappear. As she vanished, everyone round me on the upturned boat, as though they could hardly believe it, just said, "She's gone."
Well, that's the sort of thing our grandchildren will be able to do when they turn back to the beginning of the 20th century and wonder how we felt and how we thought. Whether they come in idle curiosity or as serious students of history, they will be able to recreate for themselves, at least in sound, a reasonably authentic picture of a good many of the scenes and events that we are living through now. They'll be able to listen to the voices of men who shaped and ruled our world for good or ill, just as we have heard them, and they'll be able also to hear people from all walks of life describing in their own words and in their own voices what they have experienced and felt and thought in this generation.
Even for an archivist, it's still quite exciting to hear him in 1941 talking about his vision of the World Institute of Recorded History in 2041, where he imagines people arriving by personal helicopters and going to the World War II gallery past the recordings from Mars Centre, and where people look at the index and wonder who Hitler was. It's very much, and this was in 1941, so he's very much thinking, we're living through times which need to be recorded and need to be there for the future. It's quite amazing stuff.
Linton Fletcher and Marie Slocombe, between them, had made a key connection between broadcasting and recording, but now a new concern was looming.
However, that is more or less the end of the beginning, as it were, how we began. But this was 1938, and clouds of war were beginning.
Ich habe weiter versichert und ich wiederhole Sie, dass wenn dieses Problem gelöst ist für Deutschland, es kein territoriales Problem in Europa gibt.
I have further assured him, and I emphasize it now, that when this problem is solved, Germany has no more territorial claims in Europe. I have further assured him that at the moment when Czechoslovakia has solved its other problems, that is, when the Czechs have come to an understanding with their other minorities, I shall not be interested in the Czech state anymore. And that so far as I am concerned, I can guarantee it. We do not want any Czechs anymore.
The BBC moved its library and staff to Wood Norton Hall at Evesham in Worcestershire, and Marie went there briefly at the outbreak of war. But even in rural England, things weren't as safe as they seemed.
The German broadcasters in English one time addressed the BBC, and they said, "How's your little place in Worcestershire getting on?" However, we went quietly on preparing for all this. I was sitting at Evesham, eventually, knitting balaclava helmets and socks for soldiers. And after a few weeks, I heard from London that they'd got great piles of discs piling up on the floor. There was Chamberlain, there was Hitler, there was Goebbels, there was Goering, there was... You see, history was piling in.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock,
Italia! Italia, proletario fascista! Italia, Vittorio Veneto e della rivoluzione!
Straight in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
So eventually I got them to send me back to London at Christmas 1939. And I waded in single-handed, with a hopeless arrears, actually. By the end of the war, we hadn't caught up with that, really. We hadn't made good that gap.
History was being made, but the technical means by which that history was recorded was itself changing out of necessity. The move to portability, developed for war correspondence, revolutionised the way sound archives were fed.
Oh, that developed enormously. It was fascinating, the technical skills with which they developed these little disc recorders, which, I mean, they jumped on the end of parachutes with it. Stanley Maxted, the Canadian broadcaster, jumped at Arnhem and came back with discs, the little discs under his greatcoat, and he came in with them. Those discs are still there, the original discs.
Just a few minutes ago, the fighter cover showed up, and right behind them came those lovely supply planes that you can hear up above us now. Yesterday and this morning, our supplies came, and they were dropped in the wrong place. The enemy got them. But now these planes have come over, and they've dropped them right dead over us. Everybody is cheering and clapping, and they just can't give vent to their feelings about what a wonderful sight this is. All these bundles and parachuted packages and ammunition are coming down here all around us, through the trees, bouncing on the ground. The men are running out to get them, and you have no idea what this means to us to see this ammunition and this food coming down here where the men can get it. They're such fighters that if they can only get the stuff to fight with, it's a wonderful thing. It's a shame when they can't get the stuff to fight with. You can hear the kind of flak that those planes are flying through. It's absolutely like hail up there. These enemy guns all around us are just simply hammering at those planes. But so far I haven't seen any of them hit. But the bundles are coming down. The parachutes are coming down. That's all that these men ask.
But the archivist's commonest regret is that inevitably some key events slip through the net.
De Gaulle's very first broadcast to the French, nobody knew he was going to do it. It wasn't recorded. I gather he came along and he was met by a producer from Bush House, and he jotted down some notes on the back of a menu card over a meal and rushed into Bush House and did this first broadcast. We got the second, but we didn't get the very first of all.
Not everything in the library was of huge historical moment. There was a sub-collection called Emergency Recordings, talks of various lengths, used simply to fill an unscheduled hole in the output when things went wrong.
I have a memory of one emergency, which was the head of the Indian section, a man called Zulfikar Bukhari, who later became head of All India Radio, or one of the India radios anyway. He was head of the transmissions to India. And he came through on my telephone one day and asked for an emergency recording of something of literary interest and value, like a short story or a talk by a poet or something, you see, which we had. And he wanted it 15 minutes long. And I said, oh, yes. I said, when is your gap? And he said, it's on now. I'm in Studio 3B, and it's begun. I'm in the moment playing a gramophone record. So I rushed and seized a set of discs, went down to the studio, and of course when he was playing the record you could go in and talk to him. Sorted out this recording and then sat under the table while he announced the emergency recording and sorted out the remainder of the discs in correct order and handed them up to him like this. That was a rather extreme emergency.
The sheer quantity of material deposited as a result of wartime broadcasting necessitated a formal development of the BBC's archival systems. In this, Marie Slocombe's work was to prove of lasting significance. We should remember that up to this point, libraries, archives, mostly meant paper. As far as electronic media were concerned, the rules were yet to be made, and she set about making them, with an ear on not just the content, but the sound of that content.
As I read an honours degree in French in modern languages, I wasn't an archivist, properly speaking. But I did take a correspondence course with the Library Association. I didn't get the qualification because, for the simple reason that in order to get their qualification, I would have had to give up the job for which I was wanting the training. And so then I, of course, had to sort of face up to trying to reconstruct the catalogue, which I did eventually. We were a specialised library. Not only was our material special, but we were working for special purposes. And so I remade the darn thing, for better or worse. It filled the corridor at one point. It was an enormously long, unwieldy sort of system. We called this the Iron Curtain.
And those systems, set in place after the war, continued to inform the BBC's archival policy until the turn of the 21st century. All this from a moment of reflection and a common thought between Marie and Tim Eckersley in the mid-1930s.
I mean, it seemed very naive much later. We simply said, well, these voices must be preserved.
Not just human voices either. That was the first ever recording of a bird, an Indian charmer bird, made by the German Ludwig Koch in 1889, when he was just 8 years old. An important aspect of Slocombe's post-war work was that she created an archive that became more than just a repository of BBC programme material. Marie sought out specialists like Koch, in some cases bringing into the archive not just the content, but the people who collected it.
Ludwig Koch came in, he was a refugee from Germany who had already got interested in natural history recordings.
Bullfinches were very gifted mimics of all kinds of tunes. In France we had once singing the French national anthem La Marseillaise very distinctly. There was a bullfinch in Berlin singing the communist song The Red Flag. And when Hitler came into power in 1933, somebody denounced the owner of the bird. He was arrested and was released only after the poor bullfinch had been killed. You see, even mimicking birds have to suffer under dictatorship.
We were interested in a small way in collecting natural history recordings, just as they were made for programmes, really. We were taking off the programme input. And then, at one point, we decided to develop this side, and we took Ludwig Koch onto the staff. And part of the arrangement with him was we bought his private collection. And part of his job on the staff was to work through that private collection, transfer it to master discs and get it reprocessed as part of the BBC library, we were still calling it. And Ludwig worked as a member of our department. In addition, he made expeditions and made recordings.
Then, from a remote rock in the Atlantic Ocean, the wind brought a ghost-like voice to my microphone. Yes, the singing of seals. And so the stories of sailors who have heard weird and eerie sounds came to life. And also the age-long stories of the mermaids singing on the rocks.
Ludwig Koch became a household name for radio listeners in the 1950s, and the subject of an affectionate parody by one Peter Sellers.
The second one is representative of the Scottish mouth music, sung on the mouth. I experienced some difficulty with extraneous noise on this recording. The singer, Hamish MacPukes, only gave of his best when singing on the corner of Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow. You may hear some traffic noise. Pay no attention.
Lern hört de teuren, en hört de burna, leien burna her, recht an dolla hi, mjechta turrach, porna chmahor, da hei, porna hei, echt vor.
Unfortunately, that was recorded posthumously.
In fact, Seller's comic skit isn't nearly as bizarre as the actual recording it's based on, made in Paris by Ludwig Koch himself.
Street singer with spoons. The name of his tune is Les Gamins de Paris.
Rather like natural history, we wanted to preserve folk music because it was something that was likely to die or at least to change radically, and B, we thought it was good programme material. There were the two things together. And if we didn't preserve it, it wouldn't be there. And so we tried to exchange with foreign broadcasting organisations, and we tried to encourage people in the folk music world who were scholars mainly, museum people and so on, who were by now, 50s, 60s, provided with portable tape machines and were going off on their own account to record in foreign parts. And we had various arrangements with them. We sometimes lent them tapes on the understanding that we had a first refusal of buying from them the material when they got back. Rather metaphysical kind of notion that the tapes were ours, but the material on it was theirs.
One such collector was Hugh Tracy, the creator of a huge archive of African recordings. Like Ludwig Koch, Tracy was an eloquent broadcaster of programmes using his own material. It was a logical connection. The recordists were often themselves the experts and possessed the enthusiasm to present their subject to the audience.
Now here's a song which immediately proclaims itself as Bemba by their typical use of parallel harmonies in thirds. You couldn't mistake it for any other tribal singing.
Mayo kuntenkinga ndele chiku tukabujelu wongo ba mayo kweba fika bachimana. Mayo kuntenkinga ndele chiku tukabujelu wongo ba mayo kweba fika bachimana. Tukute choba za tuwamu mwene uyawile mukutusha na tukulenga vitu yobe kwele netu ya bushoru wongo wafika mumpanga ya salami kocha machinga ya lifwile nalira nayo yomba wepanga ilalepa pakufika kwesu kumele kachirawama mayo kuntenchinga ndele chiku tukabujelu wongo ba mayo kweba fika bachimana.
The Bemba, like so many Bantu people, retain quite a number of legends about their past history. Now, these are told or sung by succeeding generations until, like this one I'll play you, the ancient words have largely lost their meaning. The singer, a man called Kiposho, couldn't interpret them for us, but clearly enjoyed the sound of the ancient and mysterious words, perhaps even more so because they were meaningless, and so had achieved a kind of ritualistic merit.
Mtuka na kumana kamuti na ina imkasho na pimba chato basta klinso mtwenge uloni na shram petra mwakwat wali watu kamshira yendi bita kunso mwali na yanda tulana sentile singamba mtulaka
Marie Slocombe's own enthusiasm for her archive led her to broadcast herself. She was a champion for the material. She wanted to personally communicate its significance to as wide an audience as possible, as in this edition of Music Now.
I think we've got probably the finest international collection of ethnic music, folk music, that exists, because we have bought from private collectors who travel with their tape machines, and we have obtained material from other radio organisations.
Do you go out and find it yourself?
I did once, yes. I went for 5 weeks to Portugal and recorded folk music there. We found in every village we visited there were little groups who sang quite spontaneously in polyphony, simple polyphony, which was not written, it was traditional. And this is an Easter hymn, which we recorded in one Portuguese village.
Can you just give me an example now of some other music that somebody has brought to you?
One recording which especially intrigued me, because of the legend about it, is a little recording from Ethiopia. You hear an instrument at the beginning, followed by a snatch of song, and the tradition is that this instrument is the harp of David. And so what you will be hearing possibly represents something like what King Saul would have heard.
Not 11 shilling all my life, 11 shilling a week. And I won't wed till I was 28 and I just 11 shilling a week. I paid 7 shilling for my job and 4 shilling for clothes and pleasure. We had some pleasure then, though. We talk of it.
Miles and millennia away from the harp of David in Ethiopia, there were sonically interesting and valuable things to preserve within the UK.
Again, that began in a very bitty sort of way. We found that programmes were occasionally coming back from the field with dialect recordings. And, you see, we were working out our selection policy all this time. We were thrashing it out among ourselves. And from the idea that, a bit of Bernard Shaw is worth keeping, we gradually developed our own ideas. It's rather full-blown to call it a philosophy, but if you like, our own ideas of what we ought to be doing. This was discussed with programme people, it was discussed among ourselves. And we said natural history is very much worth going for. Sound effects, that was more or less forced on us by the drama people who wanted them. And then we said dialect, yes, this is something that must be preserved. And we more or less took it as it came to us. We didn't go out to get it at the stage. We couldn't, we hadn't the resources. But the idea was there, you see. And eventually we developed, in cooperation with Leeds University Dialect Survey, we began to do it more systematically and in cooperation with them. They used some of our records for their survey work, they took copies. We arranged with them to be notified of good speakers, and they guaranteed the dialect, as it were. So we had this scheme with dialect.
Only little things. Never knew them start, and hillsides, awkward hillsides as they used to call them. All them hillsides at Shardil, them what man used to mow them 3 and 6 an acre. But I think big tell that you see some men used to swagger about how much they could mow.
Well, it was when we were wed at first, and we lived down Bitsquill then, a little house, and it's a bit of a garden at front, but it was not one up and one down and a cellar. And so we both worked, and I put him his jack up, to go to his work at night, and put it at table in a red handkerch, the others put it in a red handkerch. And I put it at table ready for morning, and I had to get up to my work and all, so we both get up together, and he says, "Sir, look at my jock." Hey, I said, "What's up with it?" He said, "It's all eaten." Jock Hancock and Jock and all lot were eating.
Well, I started at work just before I was 14, and I had occasion to rise about 4:30 of the morning. The hooter blowed about 5:30, and we had to be at work by 6. They allowed us 5 minutes to check in case of being a bit late. Well, when I started work, my wages were about 4 and 5 pence a week of 54 hours.
The partnership between the BBC and Leeds University, effectively to create an oral atlas of Britain, became a monumental project. We've come a long way from the concern about tentatively using licence payers' money to a point where the corporation is providing facilities for an enterprise which is truly a public service, only tangentially linked to the main remit of broadcasting perhaps, but of major importance nevertheless, nothing less than preserving historical evidence of the nation's social fabric and sound, in the full realisation that at the time, the 1940s and 50s, local culture was changing irrevocably.
We began to see the possibility of field recording on a fairly large scale by amateur people, not recording engineers, when the portable tape recording was developed. And the reason, you may wonder why on earth we thought of going out and recording folk music in the field. Well, like so many things in England, it sort of more or less just happened out of the existing conditions. It so happened that the then head of our department, head of recorded programmes, Brian George, was himself a singer. He couldn't read music. He was an Irishman, Donegal. He would count himself a folk singer. He was personally very interested. In fact, I remember that he occasionally composed a topical folk song, usually about football, because that was his other great interest, rugger. He would make up a folk song on a traditional tune, launch it in a pub in Dublin, come back to London and wait for it to turn up in the George round the corner of the BBC as a folk song. Anyway, he was personally extremely interested. That was one factor.
As I walked out one fine midsummer's morning, for to view the fields and to take the air, down by the banks of the sweet primroses, there I beheld a most lovely fair. I said, fair maid, where are you going? Or what's the cause of all your grief? I will make you as happy as any lady, if you will but grant me one more relief.
Another factor, as we've heard, was that for Marie Slocombe, the work of preservation in folk music and dialect, into which she threw herself so completely in the BBC, grew out of her involvement with the English Folk Dance and Song Society. Malcolm Taylor, librarian at the Society's headquarters, Cecil Sharp House, explains how that connection became a key part of developing oral history strategies in both organisations.
Between 1945 and 1950, there was a librarian here called Margaret Dean Smith, who happened to have worked at the BBC as a cataloguer from the late 30s up until about 1944. She would have worked with Marie Slocombe. Margaret and Marie and some others with a keen interest sort of formed a cell within the BBC, there's no doubt about it. And, you like to think it was at a time when those passions could actually manifest themselves in projects. And they obviously did, because the project of the 1950s, the Folk Music and Dialect Project, which was spearheaded by the likes of Peter Kennedy and Seamus Ennis, it was under the sort of wing of Marie.
Believe it or not, I started off as an enthusiastic folk dancer. I used to go to Cecil Sharp House and do sword dancing, Morris dancing, what we used to call Playford, which is marvellous sort of pattern work. It's beautiful stuff to do. I was very, very keen on that, and I was a dancer to start with. And it happened that our music department, they were not really interested in folk music as such. They didn't think it was music, really, I don't think. But anyway, it wasn't music as they understood it. And so it fell to our department to take this up. And there were the two people personally concerned, already sitting there, you see. And so eventually we worked out a scheme. We planned it that we would have 2 collectors in the field. The Irish Folklore Commission seconded one, Seamus Ennis, who had already worked for them in the field in Ireland, and the English Society seconded the director's son, Peter Kennedy. And it became part of my job to plan and supervise a 5-year scheme. And so with the help of the society and the people I knew, we planned field expeditions in the whole of the British Isles.
When I was a young lad, our house was a house of music. My father played the pipes and my mother played the fiddle. They both sang songs, and the visitors came with their flutes and fiddles and melodeons, but above all, ours was a house of piping. That's why my fingers grew so long. You know, stretching the holes on an Irish chanter can give a young lad cramps in his hands. Well, you can imagine me, a youngster, being allowed to stay up late, in company steeped in music, all agog and drinking in expressions like, "Up to specification, sir," and "I got that tune from Mrs. Kenny, the Queen of Irish Fiddlers, sir," whilst my mother yawned, and the men had another laughing quaff at their glasses, and Tom Cawley with his immaculate pocket handkerchief wiped from our drawing-room linoleum the drips of his silver and ebony concert flute. I could quote their names, but they're all dead now. Let them rest in peace. They used to argue, "That's not the way it's in the book." But who cares about the book when it's the way my father played it? The book is wrong. Little did I know that my father would teach me later on to read the book and go beyond my wildest dreams and become an officially paid collector myself.
And they brought in their material, and they edited it with me, and eventually we did some programs. I was editor for, I think, 26 altogether, weekly programs, 2 series of 13 weekly programs. As I roved out, with the opening line of one of the folk songs we collected in Ireland.
As I roved out on a May morning, and a May morning right early, I met my love upon the way, oh Lord, but she was early.
That's been a cornerstone of the collections here, because, you know, had that not happened, I think that a lot of the folk revival just couldn't have sustained itself. It would have had no touchstone. You know, it's one thing looking at, as I think someone like Martin Carthy would say, so it's one thing looking at the dots on the paper and the words in text, but the sound fleshed it all out. And it's the fleshing out of those manuscripts, which we've also got here, that was the significance, I think, of huge significance of Marie's work.
One Sunday morn, as I've heard say, young Richard mounted his Dobbin grey, and over the hills he rode a mule, according the parson's daughter Jean, with his doodle-dum-dollickin' doodle-dum-day, with his doodle-dum-dollickin' doodle-dum-day.
Listening to her talking in the BBC archives about her work, I was very struck by the fact that she talks about having a 5-year plan for field recording, not just for sending people out, but going out herself. That kind of strategy, forward-thinking strategy to capture and record material.
Yeah, she was there. I mean, and it's typical, I think, of Marie that when you look at the information that goes with the recordings, she's not listed. But we know she was there. I think we know she was there when Elizabeth Croning in Ireland was recorded, for example. And also she was with Pat Shoulden-Shaw when the recordings of Cecilia Costello were made in Birmingham.
Dennis Willie, dear, oh dearest Willie, whenever shall I see you again? When the fish they fly, love, and the sea runs dry, love, and the rocks they melt by the heat of the sun.
So she was there, and I understand she travelled to Portugal, so she was very much hands-on, but also being very modest with it. She liked to be seen as a background person directing others, and it was under her tutelage that Kennedy and others, because it was a new experience for them as well, of course. And now we can realise how vitally important this archive is, and her 5-year plan has really, it does now mean something. And I just wish the BBC would understand this a bit more than they do at the moment.
Simon Rooks, as BBC Sound Archivist now, you look back on Linton Fletcher and Marie Slocombe as it were, the pioneers, the founders of all this. What's your view of their legacy?
Well, I think there's a huge debt there. They were the pioneers. There are obvious achievements like the folk music collection, which is a collection of world significance. But I think the first legacy really and overall is that the fact they were recognising sound recordings as historical documents of importance and significance for the future. And they were amongst the first people to do that.
In the 50s, people who were learning their trade at the BBC, it was instilled into them a sense of posterity in what they were doing, that they were actually archiving things which would be of significance 50 or more years later. And it's absolutely right, of course. And, you could say, God help us today, because those same attitudes everything is much more disposable. I think she would have appreciated being around today to see the work that we've done here, because we've been in the process of making available that BBC archive to a new generation of enthusiasts, and they're coming in and listening to it, and it's just wonderful to watch. And that's Marie.
Marie Slocombe understood not only the importance but also the fragility of orally transmitted knowledge. Once it's gone, it's gone. She died in 1995. Not long before her death, she recorded the interview you've been listening to as part of this programme, a conversation with her colleague Maddo Stewart. It wasn't originally intended for transmission. It was made as an historical record of the facts behind the birth and development of one of the great audio archives in the world. Herself an archivist to the end, Marie knew that one day her account of things would matter. And in doing so, she felt able to make a confession. Sometimes an archivist has to be a maverick, to step outside the rules, to save the sounds of history.
Now, what about this thing called the secret cupboard, Mary?
Oh, yes. Well, we used to have, we had a number of recordings which were either illegitimate or undesirable to be used except in very special circumstances. And so we put those into the locked cupboard. One example of that, I think I can say this now, yes, was the abdication speech, We were in the habit of recording the royal broadcasts from the days of George V. And normally we should have recorded the abdication speech like any other, but we were asked not to. So, of course, we did.
But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love.
And in it went to the S cupboard, straight away. A long time later, I was rung up by a member of the royal family on my telephone, who said, I understand that in your archives you have a recording of the abdication speech broadcast. I said, oh, playing for time, coughing a bit. I said, well, actually, I believe there was a recording. I said, a pirated recording in America, which is true. And I said no more. And nothing more happened until we came to the BBC's Silver Jubilee. They had a long list of historical recordings which they wanted to use in a big feature programme, you see. And the head of features was then Lawrence Gilliam. He got the details from me, and he said, and I said, you know, you have to get permission for use of the royal voices. You have to get permission from the reigning monarch, whoever. I mean, nobody else can do it. And so he said, oh yes, well, I shall be doing that. And I said, you know, don't you, you've got the abdication broadcast recording on your list. And I said, you know, don't you, we're not supposed to have it. So he said, oh, well, he said, I shall just leave it on and see what happens. So, it came back, the king gave permission. So after that we took it out of the S. And I shall never forget the moment. I can't remember, it was one of the lesser royals who rang me and wanted to know whether we... I never answered her question, you see. I got her interested in the American one.
Marie Slocombe, who wasn't going to let anyone stop her keeping for posterity something as important as the abdication speech. Saving the Sounds of History, Marie Slocombe and the BBC Sound Archive was presented by Sean Street and produced by Julian May.